For a long time now, things just haven't been right in your town. Sometimes a strange, disgusting smell, or maybe just the light outside looks weird. But whatever it is, it keeps you awake at night. You started asking questions to your parents and teachers, but got one too many odd looks. Friends didn't want to hang out with you anymore. They just didn't see it. Your parents believed you were getting mixed up with the wrong sorts of kids playing too many video games. Maybe it's either, maybe it's both, but probably not. But it's not every day that you see a ghost on the school bus. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mildra, and I'll be your gaming monk for the evening. In the last few years, a genre of storytelling that I'm calling childhood adventure has manifested. Not the best name, I admit, but it's what will do for now until I can find a better one. This demi-genre is rooted in kids in a sleepy town discovering something more sinister in their search for adventure. Obviously, Stranger Things is going to come to mind for a lot of people, but I will not pretend this is a new phenomenon. If anything, the seeds for it were planted in the suburban suspense films in the 1980s. A couple major examples that come to mind are things like Fright Night and The Lost Boys. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the myriad of young adult mystery serials that were everywhere when I was growing up. Now, there's plenty of theories as to why this resonates, including that really, really dumb take by the massively overrated Alan Moore, but most of what he says is dumb takes, so what else is new? But I'll leave that kind of thing for the video essays. I'm just a ttrpg reviewer. That brings us to our subject matter, Ghost Club. In a game of small towns and big secrets, investigating haunted places, and eventually banishing the big bad. I will note that I did back Ghost Club on Kickstarter, but that will not play a factor into my assessment. How does it hold up? Let's find out. Ghost Club is a lighter affair than some of the other games I've reviewed. One of the advantages in having a semi-contemporary setting is that you don't have to worry too much about putting in a lot of setting material as opposed to, say, a fantasy setting. I will note that the game does one thing that's a personal pet peeve of mine in terms of flow, and that's introduce concepts and mechanics before those mechanics are properly explored. Say, for instance, referencing stats before those stats are even explained. There's a lot of effort in the thing to have a strong scrapbook-like visual design throughout the text, reminding me more of a magazine than a manual. I approve of that. The closest analog I can make is the visual emphasis in games like Mork Borg. No, I will not review Mork Borg, don't ask me to. However, I do have to note that my version of the PDF does not have bookmarks or an index. Shameful display. Character creation is built around providing a lot of cues, being a narrative-leaning game, and we'll be exploring this with Aldine once again. The first step is picking out one of the archetypes, which provide your starting attributes, a special item, and a once-per-game feature. In our case, we'll go with the Rebel, granting us the following attributes: Investigation 2, Ability 4, Knowledge 1, and Bravery 3. Next is Age, which can grant a +1 bonus to an attribute depending on the age. Aldine is 15 in this case, and thus has a +1 bonus to Knowledge for a total of 2. Lastly is your choice of Gang. The town of Twin Falls, the assumed default setting, though it's more of a vibe, has plenty of gangs formed around ghost hunting. Each of these grant a perk and reward. The latter is reward for certain actions during play. And of the available gangs, we'll go with the Wolves, who are a pack organization that are skilled in investigation, but have a bit of a territorial streak. The perk they grant is a +1 to investigation, raising that to 3. As an aside, I do like that there's a map that shows the territories of the gangs. Character creation is pretty light, and I'd imagine the use of descriptors such as phobia, favorite food, and misquotes. Having their own table means the game is very friendly to those looking for a pickup. This will be a bigger thing later on. Ghost Club uses a D6-based die pool as its core mechanic. The most common use is Investigation, which has you roll a number of D6 equal to unused fear points, the equivalent of HP, pick the highest die, and add the relevant attribute. For every one roll, some snag has occurred, usually property damage, but it's basically a but rule, i.e. you succeed, but. While for each 6 rolled, you may add 1 to the total, or bank these 6s as chroma. Regardless, this roll is compared to a difficulty number to see if you succeed in the given roll. On a failure, you can willingly spend a fear point to add 1 to a total roll. Fortunately, you do have a way to combat the loss of fear points. Unless it's stated to be unblockable, you can make a bravery roll to ignore it. However, failure in this roll adds additional fear points. If you ever reach 10 fear points used, you flee from the house until you're outside, resetting your points afterwards. Regardless, a session of Ghost Club is a 4-step affair. The first is investigation, where the party enters the haunted house, moving to different locations within the house and investigating. Essentially, you have 2 actions of either move or investigate. At the end of each turn, players must roll on the ghost die for each time they move between locations. Second is haunting, where the GM moves the ghost using a d12. If the ghost and one of the players are in the same room, they will attack that player using the ghost behavior table. This happens once for each player, and afterward they all gain 1 unblockable fear point. Third is the summoning, essentially the party calling the ghost in order to banish it. Obviously, this requires a banishment item. Now, summoning the ghost requires a bravery check, and getting attacked by the ghost happens if you end up failing. On a success, you can attempt to banish the ghost. This leads us to the 4th step, the banishment phase. Each player participating in the banishment rolls 1d6 for each banishment item they have, add any bonus modifiers, and compare it to the ghost's power level. If successful, the ghost has been banished. The whole time I was reading through this, I kept being reminded of the board game Clue. In fact, the board from that board game may make an excellent visual representation of the gameplay loop. It's clear that having a room layout is essential, but the big thing that hurts the game is not having a written down, unified role, and instead having a set of sub-roles for investigation, bravery, and so on. It's not quite as subsystem heavy as some games I've seen, but it does cut things a little bit close. Unfortunately, there's a good amount of maps to utilize, but I would not advise playing this kind of game in a theater of the mind style. It's best to have a map at the very least. I'll get this out of the way first. If you're thinking of Stranger Things with this, don't. This is clearly meant for one-shot investigations rather than any overarching story. Now, it's very dedicated to that, but it does mean it's going to be a little tricky when you're trying to go off on your own. In that regard, it kind of reminds me of the tabletop games I see out of Japan. Still, for those who want the tabletop equivalent of an 80s suburban spooky, this is a pretty good entry. And I could see it being used to bring newcomers into the hobby with how it straddles the line between board game and RPG. Much to the chagrin of certain grogs, but you all know how I feel about grogs. All that said, I think I'd rate it as playable. It's a decent affair, but you may have some trouble if you're not using one of the pre-generated maps. Beyond that, I think the game is very solid for the price that it's at. Stay frosty.